"We literally have bats in the belfry," said Hannah, my wife, as she lay in her sickbed. She began to laugh, but this descended into a fit of coughs. A line of blood streamed from her mouth to her chin. I wiped it off gently with a damp flannel I held in my latex-gloved hand. "We do indeed," I confirmed, speaking through my fabric face mask. Hannah had wondered about the fluttering noises emerging from the tower. "Pipistrelle bats, I believe," I said, in a kindly voice. We called this derelict monastery home after fleeing the city. Deep in the woods, it served as a perfect place to isolate ourselves from the terror encompassing the world. The monastery sat derelict, unused for decades, but still retained some serviceable rooms fit for just the two of us, despite smashed windows and crumbling masonry. We fled here in my car a week ago, escaping the pandemic, the return of humanity's old enemy, Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague, the Black Death. We thought we had beaten it. We felt the disease had been confined to the history books. We were wrong. A new strain, resistant to antibiotics, emerged. Some nations blamed others, claiming that this new infection escaped from a laboratory. The finger-pointing did not help when the buboes appeared and the deaths began. 3 years ago, I'd been a doctor in Africa, treating Ebola and Mpox outbreaks, but this worldwide sickness spread on an altogether different scale. As a doctor, I had been at the forefront as people became ill. Once we realized that antibiotic treatment was no longer effective, panic spread. As soon as the dark lumps appeared on people's armpits, necks and groins, they sought me out, begging for help. This strain attacked and spread in a far more aggressive fashion. Without any recognizable treatment, death was certain. No cases of anyone surviving infection existed. We may have won many battles against the bacteria, but the plague was set to win the war. Being on the front line put Hannah and myself in danger, being at risk of constant transmission. Once we realized we could do nothing, we fled, sharing this fallen monastery in the woods with the bats. We told nobody, afraid that the desperate would still try and locate us, even though I could provide no treatment. I brought some basic medical supplies, along with food and water to last us months. We would lie low for as long as we could, while the disease spread and wiped out all the infected. Wait for it to abate, then return to whatever world remained after this mass extinction. I knew this was the only possible path to survival. But after just a few days here, Hannah's skin began to show dark patches, which then turned into lumps. She got sick and then bedridden. It was too late for her. All I could do was try and make her final hours as comfortable as possible. As someone used to seeing advancing disease and death, I still found it hard to accept in the one person dearest to me. As the last few days went by, I sat with her. I administered what little morphine I'd brought with me and sat by her side as she slipped in and out of consciousness. In her lucid moments, we spoke about our past, the day we met at the pier at the seaside, our Greek island wedding, along with the laughter and the tears of a life spent together. When she died, in the early hours before dawn, the only sound I could hear was the fluttering of the bats in the brick tower. I'm not ashamed to say that I shed many tears for the loss of my beloved Hannah, and also for the cruelty of a world brought down by an invisible killer. I covered her frame with a white sheet. Still overcome by grief, I departed through the shabby wooden doors that sat below the bell tower. I went into the surrounding woods. Spending hours gathering sticks and branches, I piled them high in front of the monastery until I built a bed of wood for me to lay her upon. Wearing my protective scrubs, Her body felt light and fragile as I lifted her onto the bower, the disease having ravaged her frame. Siphoning a little fuel from my SUV, I poured it onto the pyre. The afternoon turned into evening by the time I started to fire. Still covered by the white sheet, I sat and watched as the flames grew, all-consuming, killing the bacteria and sending Hannah's ashes up into the night sky. I sat for hours as the night passed, my face warmed by the heat. I sat in the knowledge that countless other fires were igniting across the globe for the same reason. As I watched, I saw the bats swoop and circle through the red glare, feasting on the moths and other flying insects attracted to the glow. At some points, exhaustion and sorrow overtook me, and I fell asleep. A cold, misty dawn broke when I stirred from slumber. The pyre still smoked, the child want strong in my nostrils. A few shafts of sunlight filtered through the leaves of the wood, and I retreated back into the monastery to warm myself next to the hearth I had cleared and built. My mind too full of grief to contemplate my own future, I gathered my sleeping bag around me. I must have spent all day in slumber, because all around was dark when I awoke. The coldness had vanished. I felt warm despite the hearth bowing down. When I realized I was sweating, I went over to the mirror near my camp bed and removed my shirt. I saw a large black stain spread over my skin between my armpit and my neck. There it was. I'd also caught the plague. My own days were now numbered. A strange calmness followed my initial shock. What had I to live for, anyway? Now Hannah had gone, along with the rest of the world. Only one decision remained on my mind. How did I want to leave my life? Having seen the effects of the disease, the pain, vomiting, the weeping souls, I knew that I did not want to die that way. Checking on my remaining morphine, I had enough for a single, pain-killing dose, but not enough to euthanize myself. I also had a scalpel in my medical bag, but the thought of watching my blood spilling out of me as I faded filled me with dread. As I contemplated my remaining mortality, the sound of the bats fluttering in the tower reached me. I could climb up there, up the ladder, to the roof. It sat high above the surrounding treetops. A fall would certainly be fatal. Close my eyes, a rush of air, and it would all be over. How could I contemplate suicide? By my bed stood a photograph of Hannah and I on our wedding day, smiling on a beach next to a crystal clear sea. I picked it up, and my tears welled up once again. My years of medical practice taught me that life is precious, that we should cling on to it, no matter the cost, for as long as possible. Where there is life, there is hope. As I looked at that photo, my hope departed, and despair took me. With a sudden action, I stood galvanized. I ignored the voice inside my head that counseled caution, and I strode over to the door at the tower. Inside, I climbed the wooden staircase that wrapped around the square construction, taking them two at a time. My breath came in gasps. All the time, my brain insisting that I wait, that I think about this some more. Or my despair overrode my lifelong devotion to the preservation of life. At the top of the staircase sat a landing area, covered in bat droppings. A wooden ladder extended to the roof. Here, gaps in the masonry appeared, and hung from the rafters, the Pipistrelle bats found their roost, their feet gripping onto the rotten mud. At this time of the evening, they arrived and departed through the holes in the wall. Ignoring them, I made for the hatch, climbing the ladder a rung at a time. My thighs and biceps felt heavy, an ache brought by the bacteria invading every cell of my body, as I gritted my teeth and forced myself upwards. As I neared the hatch, I reached up and grabbed the next rung. As I did so, I felt a tickle on my fingers. A bat had found a roost here, and I grabbed his foot. I heard a squeak, and then a brief flutter as the bat escaped my clutches, immediately followed by a sound of 1,000 umbrellas being opened. The swarm struck me. Defending their roost, they spun around me, still clinging to the ladder. They squeaked and scratched. I could see nothing but their leathery wing flaps and mouse-like bodies. I fell and took several breaths before I struck the landing. Everything went black. When I awoke, my first thought was the pain at the back of my head. My vision returned, swirling in front of my eyes. When I tried to move, several bats squeaked and flew off me. Sitting up, I checked the back of my head and felt a large lump. I then noticed that I was covered in patches of blood where the bats had scratched and burned me. I took a few deep breaths. Looking up, the flying mammals still circled, but had stopped attacking. I tried to get to my feet, but a pain shot up my calf from my ankle. It was either sprained or broken. In any case, I had no chance of climbing to the roof. Cursing my misfortune, I lid-backed to the stairs and descended back down them. Dizziness and pain mingled as I reached the ground floor, but I managed to make it to my camp bed before I collapsed, unconscious. I cannot recall how long I slept. Maybe it was a day or maybe 2, but when I awoke I felt thirsty. My head throbbed so much I felt nauseous. Soreness came from all over my body, and in the moonlight that filtered through the windows, I saw dried blood covering my clothing from my pierced skin. In addition to all this, I could not stand on my right leg, and my ankle had swollen to twice the size. I took a bottle of water I kept beside my bed. My hands shook as I raised it to my lips, and as the water entered my mouth, my throat seemed to gag and spasm as I swallowed what felt like razor blades. I switched on the battery-powered lamp. I was a mess. I leaned on my left leg as I stood, balancing my hand on the bed frame for support. The mirror lay ahead. A pale face and sunken eyes looked back at me. Wondering how long I had left, I took off my shirt. Although covered in bites and scratches, I saw no purple-black bruise, no inflamed pustules or buboes erupting at my skin. What was this? I still felt gravely ill, but the signs of the infection had vanished. I quickly checked over the rest of my body. Nothing. No outward sign of plague. My experience taught me that some diseases could regress a little before returning, although this seemed unlikely given the aggressiveness of this strain. I have not seen this in anyone I had treated thus far. No, some other explanation must exist. As I considered what could be happening, I treated the areas of broken skin with iodine. Sat back on my bed, I wiped them with cotton wool and the disinfectant. My hands shook as I did so. My headache worsened to the point I could barely see, and I was running a temperature. I wondered whether I had contracted sepsis. My shakes worsened, and I attempted to reach for my water bottle once again. This time, I could not even get it to my lips, and I dropped it to the floor, the water spilling over the cold stone. Shivering uncontrollably, I managed to bed back down again, pulling the blanket over me. The night passed fitfully. I opened my eyes to a noise, a fluttering. It was the bats. They surrounded the monastery. Not just a few this time, but an army. I let out a scream as I saw a figure in the darkness beyond my lamp. I could not see his expression, just his brown robes. The hood hung low down over his face. He stood, arms folded in his sleeves, just out of view in the darkness. In the shadows beyond, he was joined by others, assembling to look at me. I heard a mysterious, dark chanting emanating from these terrifying monks. And all the time, the squeaking of the bats surrounding the place intensified. The monks turned their backs to me, looking at the doors that opened out to the woods beyond. They approached them, and I realized their intention. The bats outside were seeking entry, and the monks would give it. I tried to shout for warning, but just a low moan came from my parched lips. The doors swung open. A mist lay beyond, and I wondered where the bats had gone. But then they came. They burst through the opening, en masse, filling the spaces around me. They consumed the monks in a whirling tornado. The windows smashed, shards of glass exploding all around, and more bats streamed in. Like a cloud caught in a gale, they swarmed towards me. I saw their red eyes and glistening fangs. Their wings tipped with sharp talons. They meant to have me. I lifted the blankets as protection, and once again, blackness overtook me. A shuddering breath, and then a bright light. I awoke to the morning of the world. Lifting the blanket off my head, I peeled myself from the mattress where my sweat and blood had dried. My ankle throbbed, my head was painful to the touch, and my wounds itched as they healed. The water bottle lay on the floor where I had dropped it, and I picked it up. A few drops remained, and I drank in a single refreshing gulp. I managed to stand, and I grabbed another bottle and downed it in one. Hobbling over to a wooden bench, I sat and pondered what had occurred. I could not guess how many days I had been lying on that bed, unconscious. The doors were closed, the windows intact. I'd been hallucinating. My breathing came easier, and my energy levels returned, as did my reasoning. Despite everything, I smiled as my thoughts turned to my own diagnosis. I had caught the plague, that was for sure, but then the bats intervened. They had bitten and scratched me. 3 years ago, I had been in Africa, treating illnesses. Before I went, I myself had received vaccinations against certain diseases. One of these was rabies. A few minutes later, I sat in my car and made ready to return to civilization. I'd used a branch to support my weight, bandaged my wounds, and injected myself the final dosage of morphine against the pain. I had news. Rabies, that fatal, deadly virus, was also deadly to the bacteria Yersinia pestis. Rabies was a phage. I had experienced rabies, but the vaccination, that should have only protected for a few months, must have lain dormant in me. As the disease progressed, a few antibodies remaining in my system activated and fought it off. I wasn't sure if much of the world remained, but I now knew that my blood contained antibodies. The fight against infection returned. We had an answer. One deadly disease would kill another. A lump in my throat formed as I contemplated what may have been. I should not have given up despair. Hope exists where life lingers. Answers often come from an unlikely source. As I started the car, I looked up at the tower and saw the Pipistrelles circling.